So, Didi Madloba for inviting me here. It's nice to see many familiar faces and also many new faces. I've been here quite a lot in this building and in the previous Heinrich Böll building, first as a recipient of the Heinrich Böll Fellowship, then as an alumnus, then as expert. Now I'm back again. So I will try to answer the question, but before that, we need to make a couple of important, I have to outline two important things. First, that when we are talking about 1 year since the revolution, it's in a way it's correct because the revolution, the active part of the revolution took place in April and May 2018, but at the same time, it's only been 4 months or 5 months, depending on how you count, since the new government has been formed. Because since May, just to remind you the basic facts, in May 2018, Nikol Pashinyan became the prime minister and he formed a cabinet. But the parliament was still dominated by the forces from the old political establishment, mostly the Republican Party, and mostly its allies, some of which changed camp, and there was a coalition government for some time. But in any case, until December 2018, the majority in the National Assembly was, the majority belonged to the Republican Party, which in a parliamentary system, which is Armenia today, basically represents a constitutional crisis. So basically the second half of 2018 was mostly devoted to resolving this constitutional crisis, and it was finally resolved, and it was quite complicated. Now a lot of people don't, a lot of people abroad haven't heard about it because it wasn't as spectacular as what was happening in April and May, but it was quite a complicated process because in order to resolve this crisis, Nikol Pashinyan had to resign, and then the parliament had to not elect him again. So, and basically that was a very fragile moment when things could go wrong. Eventually everything worked out. We had an election in December, and in January the new government was formed. So basically, we can talk about full, 4 or 5 months of the new government. And the second thing which I wanted to discuss before saying what happened is to say a couple of words about what hasn't happened. And again, today we might not remember, but immediately after Pashinyan became prime minister, there were voices that predicted all kinds of horrible things, economic meltdown, internal instability, even civil war, international collapse, collapsing relations with all Armenia's partners, an escalation in Karabakh conflict, etc., etc. And none of these things have happened. Economically, if we look at the situation, there have been some ups and downs since the revolution, but in general the economy has been quite stable. And if we look at the rate of the currency, the Armenian currency has stayed remarkably stable throughout the whole period, beginning with the days of the revolution and then all the time until now. If we talk about political stability, internal stability and the threat of civil war, this has been completely not relevant for Armenia. There's nothing that is even very remotely reminding any kind of civil conflict that has taken place in Armenia. And talking about the international situation, again, Armenia has been able to maintain its relations both in the north, in the west, in the south, even in spite of very complicated geopolitical settings which are beyond Armenia's reach. And when looking at the Karabakh conflict, again, we can say that the situation on the line of contact has been more calm after the revolution than before. There have been less incidents. The dialogue between the heads of governments has begun, and So there are, again, I wouldn't call it reasons for optimism, because so much has been said about windows of opportunities and breakthroughs in Karabakh conflict that it has been feeding some unrealistic expectations, but at least we have a stable situation also in the Karabakh conflict. So this is what hasn't happened, things that could have happened and haven't happened. And now to things that did happen. And here I have to say that some of the things that happened throughout this year were, now they seem quite normal, but 2 years ago, if you asked anybody in Armenia, do you believe that this is possible? 99% of the people would say no. This is impossible in Armenia, this will never happen in Armenia, or maybe this will happen in 10 years later. For example, free and fair elections, results of which have been accepted by all parties. And this is, even if everything that happened last year had taken place just for this, still it would be a great achievement. In September 2018 we had local elections in Yerevan, the Council of Elders as we call it, so the city council of Yerevan was elected, clean elections, no complaints basically. And then in December we had general elections to National Assembly. In between we had other local elections, and in these two elections it was My Step Alliance which won, but in between we had elections where other politicians that were not connected to Nikol Pashinyan won the elections, as for example in the city of Kapan in autumn 2018. So it's not just the ruling party that won the elections. And these elections were deemed as free, democratic by the international observers, by the civil society inside Armenia, and even the losing parties have not tried to protest the results of the election, which is something that hasn't happened in Armenia for decades. So every election in Armenia has been a debated election, every election until 2018. The last free and fair election, which was more or less accepted by the society as such, happened in 1991, when the election, actually Soviet Union still existed at the time. So throughout the history of post-Soviet Armenia, elections were a major problem, and we have, obviously just one election doesn't mean that we have completely solved this problem, but it is, at least, of course, it's a great step forward. Another thing which again seemed like completely impossible only a couple of years ago, the systemic corruption has been defeated. And here the word systemic is very important, because of course we cannot claim that there is no single case of corruption in Armenia at the moment. Obviously in all countries sometimes there may be cases of corruption, but the system of corruption which was functioning in Armenia until 2018 has been defeated. And what I mean by that is before 2018 we had a situation which can be described as capture of state, when we had some informal networks which dominated the state institutions, and they used the state institutions to extract benefits from them, which could be in the forms of bribes, it could be in the forms of certain business preferences, which often were, the same officials were also the owners of certain businesses. It meant that certain officials or people close to the government had a monopoly in a certain field in the economy, etc. So all this systemic corruption has been broken. This pyramid of corruption went from the lowest level of state officials out to the very top. There was a chain of corruption. This system does not exist anymore. Does it mean that we have completely excluded the re-emergence of this system? At this point, probably not. For this, we need more institutional reforms, because at this point, it mostly depends on the political will of the current government. So we do have to go further. We do have to implement institutional reforms, which will probably include creation of a separate and independent anti-corruption agency. So there's a lot of work to do in this field. I'm not saying that we've completely resolved the problem of corruption in Armenia, but today there is no systemic corruption in Armenia. Another issue is the equality before the law. Again, before 2018, in Armenia, you had a situation where, in reality, not on paper, obviously, but in reality, you had two groups of citizens. There was one group of citizens who was above the law, which meant people close to the government, big business people, officials, their relatives, and so on, who basically could break any law when they wanted and get away with it. Of course, it depended on how high you were in this chain. You know, did the journalists know about this or not? Did NGOs know about this or not? But in general, this was a privileged group which was in a way above the law. And then there was the rest of the citizens who were, not privileged. This situation is gone. Obviously, this was not something that existed on paper, but I think any person from a post-Soviet country understands what this means. We still have this in many post-Soviet countries, and this has been completely removed. Today, most citizens in Armenia, I'm sure if you go and ask them, they would say that they feel that now they're equal before the law. And this also means that in the field of economy there have been changes, that particularly the system of monopolies is breaking down. So in the past you had certain businessmen who enjoyed a monopoly in a certain field, not because they were so successful that they reached a monopoly, but because they were able to use the state institutions to protect their position. So for example, there was a person who was considered the banana king of Armenia because the rumors were that he controlled the import of bananas, who was also a state official, then a member of parliament. Now he's under investigation and he's asking for political asylum in a third country. And we have a lot of cases like this. Russia. Well, okay. And he hasn't got it yet. So, and I don't know what his political views are because I've never heard him express any political views. But anyway, so this is an example of how this fight against the corruption also is leading to demonopolization of the economy. Here, of course, it's more complicated than that. It's not just, if you arrest a corrupt official, it's somehow things sort themselves out, because obviously for years we have had a situation where certain companies had an advantage, and they still may have this advantage because you simply cannot force them to surrender the market. But at least when they're playing by the new rules, it means that the situation is more equal, and the share of these companies that used to have a complete monopoly is slowly but definitely going down. Anyway, I can talk about this a lot. I will just add a couple of words about the challenges that we are facing. Obviously, there is the challenge of economic. We are talking about economic revolution, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about it more, but obviously it's going to be difficult because there are very high expectations. We are hopeful and we are optimistic, but there's a lot of work to do there. The issue of transitional justice, because even though a lot of corruption cases have been resolved, in some cases, these people are under arrest. Right now there's a trial going on about a certain general who is accused of a very blatant case of corruption and so on, but there are cases which cannot be resolved through court for different reasons, because they happened too long ago, because there's already a court decision, because people who suffered from it, they have lost their homes and these homes simply don't exist anymore. So there are a lot of issues where you have to restore the justice, and we are now debating different models of transitional justice. And of course the judicial system, because we've had a system of courts which has long been dependent on the executive. Today the executive government is not putting any pressure on the courts, but there is still a danger that the people from former government who have had links with certain elements in the court system, they could still have some links to it, and they could still be able to exert some pressure on that. So we have to deal with that, and we also have to make sure that we have an independent and not corrupt judiciary. So these are just some of the challenges that we are still facing, and I will stop here, and maybe my colleagues will talk more about this.